Hey everyone. So I know it's been a while since we've had kind of like one of these devlogs where I actually walk you through a coding project I'm like working on, but I really want to get back to that. And I actually have one that I think will be maybe a little bit interesting for everybody to sort of follow. So I'm developing a mobile app, and it's going to be native to Android. The actual app idea itself is not really that cool. It's basically just like a meal planning slash organizing tool for the dinners that you're going to cook throughout a week. So nothing super exciting. It's just something that my wife asked me to make a while ago. And even though I know that there's probably plenty of apps out there that do it and do it well, I do want to make this app not because I'm really interested in like the subject matter or like that particular idea, but I am really interested in developing another app that I plan to do native to Android. And so doing this app as like a warm up, I think will be a good way to bridge the gap of some of my knowledge. Just in general, it's been so long since I've developed an Android app. Like last time I developed an Android app, like Java was, king. And now they definitely, promote Kotlin. Kotlin's matured. There's a lot more to it now, and it's way more prevalent. So that'll be like a learning curve for me, like to learn Kotlin. But I don't think it'll be that bad. Yeah, so yesterday I spent quite a few hours really just going through and sort of breaking down everything from the more abstract concept that my wife sort of gave me to, really getting it granular and figuring out exactly what I really need to do to actually bring this app to life. And I have a pretty good like roadmap, and I'll show that up here somewhere. I have a pretty good design document idea where did put some limitations on myself because I don't want this to snowball into a project that's too huge. Because again, this is just supposed to be a big like learning opportunity to get me to the more ambitious app. But at the same time, I do want it to have like certain bits of functionality and sort of additions. So with my roadmap in mind, I think I'm good to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go in here to this coffee shop and get some work done. But yeah, I guess I'll see you all in a second.
All right, so to kick off the project, I wanted to start by getting my database going first because it's going to be central to everything else that happens on the backend server side. I decided to go with SQL, so specifically I'll be using Postgres because the data is incredibly relational. And I'm not going to go over the full schema here, but we will basically have a main users table, main recipes table, and a main recipe books table, and some other tables to support the interactions between those different models. To model the database in Go, I'm actually going to be using the SQL C library. So I'm not going to be going over the full reason as to why I picked it here, but if you're really interested into why I'm using that library and not some others, I actually wrote a blog post about it, and I'll link that down in the description for you all to view. The long and short of it really is just that this library is going to make it very easy for me to have functions and structs that are auto-generated so I can interact with the database, and all I have to really do is just define the schema and define the queries that are going to be used by those functions. So ironically enough, while I use SQL in practically every project I do, I always have something more to learn in SQL, and I was pretty sure I probably would have missed something. So I decided to actually take my schema and pass it into Gemini to see if it had any sort of recommendations as to what could be improved with the schema. So some of it was, questionable, but it actually did a really good job in providing some really solid recommendations. And so I decided to take those improvements and really implement them in my schema going forward. After adding those recommendations to my schema, as well as generally just polishing it up, I was able to run the migrations along my database, and then I was able to actually query the database for my test account by using the server. After I was able to confirm that my server was able to interact with the database using this generated code, I decided I would just spend a little bit more time that day adding a few more queries to the database, and then I decided to wrap it up there. All right, so I decided to kick off this session by actually adding the Firebase admin SDK to the server so I could use it to handle all the user authentication. Honestly, this part was actually pretty straightforward, but what I had issues were with the IAM roles that I needed to create the Firebase token. So sorry, but I'm going to take you all on a tangent here. Ultimately, IAM, for those who might not be familiar, is a tool that a lot of cloud providers will use to control accesses to resources, in your digital cloud, right? It allows admins to make sure that users of their organizations can't just access anything, or maybe don't have certain permissions to do certain things to certain resources, right? So ultimately, I had issues with creating the Firebase token, specifically on the Firebase webpage. When you go to create the token, I kept getting this error. So eventually, digging into the error, it turns out that I had a policy on the user that was trying to create it, and it was the disable service account key creation that was enabled. So I needed to disable that. Well, to actually disable that, I had to do a bunch of things with my organization policy, but essentially what I had to do was, at the top level, I had to add the organization policy admin role to my admin user that existed for that particular project, the Foodtastic project, and then I was able to actually override that service account creation role. That still didn't fix the issue in Firebase though. So I decided just to read through all the roles that were available, and then I found this other role, and it's labeled Disable Service Account Key Upload. So it wasn't mentioned in any of the Firebase documentation, or at least none that I referenced, but I decided, why not try to, just enable it. So basically I disabled the disable. So I enabled it. um, anyway, after I did that, I was able to actually click the create token on Firebase, and it worked just fine. So I think the reason why this happened is because Firebase is technically a separate service. I think that while it, needed permission to be able to create the key, right? So I had to disable the disable for the account key creation. I think because, again, it is Firebase that's actually creating the token, but it's going to get stored in your Google Cloud account, I think it also needed permission to upload it, but it just wasn't in their documentation. So at least that's my best guess. If any of you all have run into any sort of issues like this with Firebase, or just in general when it comes to IAM roles and things like that, I'd love to hear it down below. Because, while I'm not necessarily new to it, it's not also something that's the most intuitive thing to me. So yeah, I'd love to hear about that below if you have any sort of interesting issues or stories or anything like that. Anyway, after I figured all that out, I was able to successfully create a user in Firebase using my server, and I decided to wrap up the session by adding a verification middleware. You see, in my design, a user should only be able to receive data from the server that belongs to them. And because I'll be using Firebase for the authentication, I needed to add verification into my server so that when users make requests to my server using the token that they've received from Firebase, my server will be able to verify who they are, and they'll be able to return the data that just belongs to that specific user. So at this moment, I'm not going to actually add the full verification, but I am just going to go ahead and set all the boilerplate, so that way when I do want to connect my server up for the verification, I'll already have this ready to go, and it'll be pretty simple to change.
Been working on the app, and up to this point, I've just worked on the back end of it. So, like getting the server set up, getting the database set up, and getting everything connected to Firebase, which is going to handle the authentication. So now I'm at the next part of that, which is the last thing I did on the server was verify, Firebase tokens. But the only way I'm really going to be able to test that is to create the actual app and have a user go through the sign-in flow. So I got a lot of learning to do. So I think where I'm going to start is I'm just going to go through. They have a tutorial for Kotlin and app development. So I think we'll go through the boot camp of it at least a little bit, just to kind of get a feel of everything. And then I think I'm just going to dive straight into the Firebase auth, adding it, and we'll see if we can get it all connected up with our backend. That's where I'm going to get started. So yeah, y'all come with me. Just going to go sit at a coffee shop and walk through a tutorial. So see y'all in a minute.
Alrighty, y'all. I got to be really honest about this one. This is probably my least favorite part. The way I like to learn is just by diving in. I'm not really the whole sit down and do this digital course sort of person, right? So I like to dive in. I like to just read documentation when I get stuck. But because it was just so much new at one time, we're talking new language with Kotlin, we're talking about a new architecture pattern between all of the many ways to build an Android app, right? So I decided that it'd be best to just kind of buckle down and just do some of their intro tutorial stuff, at least to get up to speed. So that's what I did. I didn't fully go through any one of the tutorials realistically, or any of the like developer paths, but I did do quite a bit, and I did reference back to them as I had like questions, even after I completed the initial sort of like learning montage that you see here.
All right, everyone. So I spent a lot of time yesterday just diving into the Android side, and man, it is way more complicated than I thought. No, it is way more complicated. Like the way that things are handled, the way like the life cycle of the Android app works and everything like that. It's really complicated. But yesterday, after quite a lot of trial and error, I was able to get the sign in to like work. But there's a few problems. So the biggest thing is I'm not doing things the way you're expected to do it. So ideally, as I understand it, with intent workflows, you want to kind of separate your activities by their intent. And so right now I have like all of the logic that handles the sign in stuff in one intent. So the problem with that really is not when I go to sign in. When I sign in, everything works the way I want it to. The problem is like signing out, right? And the whole idea is essentially I want to skip that sign in intent if we're signed in. And then on sign out, I want to launch a new activity with a new intent that is like, here's the sign in page, right? So, or the base of the app, whatever. So I need to like work on that. I need to figure that out. I actually did run into another issue. So I decided to change over from allowing users to sign in with an email and password to just allowing users to sign in with Google. The problem with this is now the sign in and the sign up is handled entirely by Firebase. So it doesn't hit my server at all. So my server, my backend server needs to know who a user is. So the idea is originally, if you had an email and password, you hit my server, you sign up, then that user gets created for you in Firebase as well. Now it's the opposite. The user's created in Firebase, so I need a way for Firebase to communicate to my database that like, hey, I've created this user and you need to add this entry to your database. But I can't add that logic to the app because if the app crashes or something like that, that doesn't make any sense. Also, the app shouldn't have permissions to be able to hit any endpoint that allows it to change the database entries for a table that the user doesn't natively own, and the user doesn't own the user table. They own their data in other tables that's linked to their user. So I think how I'm going to solve this is with, I think it's called Cloud Functions, and I think that will solve it because if I'm understanding Cloud Functions correctly, then what I should be able to do is I don't know if I don't know if I had to set it up like in Cloud Functions itself, but I should be able to create a function that will make that database entry in my local database. So like hit my server and add that entry, and it should be able to authenticate with that server endpoint. So I need to look into that. But I think where I'm actually going to start today is just getting the intent, the login functionality buttoned up a bit. I'm going to work on that first, and I'm going to think about the Firestore stuff a little bit more with the cloud function.
Hey y'all. Um, Mobile app development is no joke. There, it really is like a whole different paradigm. Like, for example, yesterday I spent hours, like probably like 4 hours, just getting this sign in to work properly. And what I mean by that is like making sure that user could sign in, the app was aware of the state, the app was aware if a user signed out, and made sure that flow worked successfully. That took me like 4 hours to get right. I'm moving on to the next part of the app, which is arguably more complex, but theoretically the last like design decision, I guess. Now the app can sign in, and we have the backend API, which we already wrote, which we already started writing, right? We'll probably have to modify it a bit, but now we need the app to be able to fetch that data. That adds some complexity. But the biggest thing is what we really need to do, and we don't have to do it this way, but I am going to do it this way because I think it's the best way of doing it. I think it's the best practice, and I am ultimately building this app to not just get this app done, but really dive into native Android app development. So I want to do it the suggested sort of way. Unidirectional data flow, I think is what they call it. And I don't know. I misunderstood what they meant at first, but essentially what they mean is data flows, and they have a diagram for it. But there's essentially a data layer, and then there's your UI layer. And the whole idea is that data flows down from your data layer into your UI layer. And then what flows up are events only. So like data doesn't flow up, but events flow up. But theoretically, like the events do contain some data when they flow up. So not to get too in the weeds on that, that is like the next step, I think, which is like getting the data layer created and getting that stuff started. The real complication about that is, one, it's going to require like refactor of everything I've done so far. Just, whatever. It's not like it took me hours to get to this point. But it's also going to require me interacting with, of course, my API. And so why that's complicated is because the client, the HTTP client, is going to live in the data layer. Like if you're familiar with other languages, it's, I guess fairly simple. You have a lot of options. Android is a little bit different. You still do have a lot of options, but you have to think about things very differently. So there's a few options, and I think I'm going to go with retrofit. And it's not really important in how it all works. But the nice thing about it, or at least what I hope will be the nice thing about it, is you essentially identify or define interfaces for your API. And these defined interfaces allow you to, interact with the API, but interact with it in a easily serializable objects in Kotlin and Java. So I'm going to try it. It adds another level of complication, and I think that's probably why, like, you all could probably read this on my face, but the frustration I'm facing like right now with all this is like there's just so much new stuff. Like I can't do a simple thing. Like what I want to do is like really simple, and I can't do a simple thing without learning like 15 or sorry, I can't do one simple thing without learning like two complex things. But to create the data layer thing, I'm going to have to learn about like view models, and how to use a view model in the UI such that all of the logic that I've been putting into the UI only exists like in the view model, and then the view model interacts with the data layer and pulls that information back down and filters that back down to the UI layer. Basically, I've got to learn unidirectional data flow, and I've got to learn how to create the data layer.
12 sleepless hours later.
Alrighty, y'all. So it might be really hard to tell between all the technical jargon and all the many cuts in this video, but making a mobile app is incredibly difficult. I'm actually really happy with how much of the roadmap I was able to complete in this first 2 weeks on the project. In the span of the last 2 weeks, I went from knowing practically nothing about Android app development to actually being able to complete flows and really not just complete them, but understand what I was doing as I was like working on the app. And while I have learned a lot about this app in particular, there is still a long way to go with it. And in fact, I'm actually going to be making an update video here as I continue on in the next few weeks with this mobile app. But I'm really excited to move forward. I think that while there is still a lot to do and a lot of pieces that I'm missing, um, I think this app has done, or so far, it's done what I really wanted it to do. It's really sparked my interest in mobile app development, and I want to continue on with that journey. So thank you all so much for coming along on this super chaotic journey with me. If you liked the video at all, please make sure you like, please make sure you comment, please make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.